Hello, hello. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Duncan Chappell. I'm delighted to be introducing Mark McClardy for today's webinar. We've got a discussion around sustainability where Westcon is really able to bring forward quite a different perspective, not only because of its own leading position particularly in the European and Asia Pacific markets as a distributor that has a substantial environmental responsibility, transparency activity going on, but also because of the way that it's connected to so many organizations in a vital place in the supply chain. We'll be hearing from Mark in a moment. Just a few housekeeping notes. You will have been in a webinar before, you probably know how it works. There's a Q&A panel down there. We would love you to use the Q&A. There's a chat option. Please use that for any like specific housekeeping things you don't want to share. Maybe there's a sound problem or an audio problem, video problem. Let us know about that. We are recording the webinar, and the recording will be made available afterwards, so you don't have to break your hand taking down notes. You can enjoy and participate. Mark, as I think people will have seen in the profile, is heading up sustainability and responsible business initiatives for Westcon. Is based here in the UK. And Mark, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Duncan. Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. So as Duncan said already, my name is Mark McClardy, and I'm currently in the role of Head of ESG at Westcon Comstor. I'm really excited to be here today and have the opportunity to talk to you about our Responsible Business Programme. I really hope that you find this session insightful, and as Duncan's mentioned already, please do make use of the Q&A functionality. We would like to make this webinar as interactive as possible, so please don't be shy, put your questions in there, and we're going to have plenty of time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that you might have. So just to give you a bit of background, I've been with Westcon Comstor just shy of 12 years now. My background's really in operations, so I spent 7 years or so working in sales operations within our global deployment solutions team, as it was known then. And then I moved on and spent 3 or 4 years working in logistics and supply chain in a project manager role before taking up the head of ESG role at the beginning of our financial year 23, which was March of this year. So clearly a very exciting time to be working in sustainability. And I'm really grateful, as I mentioned already, just to have a bit of time to talk to you today about what we've been doing and what we're planning in the future as well. So I thought a good place to start would be for me to really kind of rewind 18 months or so ago within our business to talk a little bit around where we really came from, because I think, well, I hope you'll agree once I've run through this presentation that we've made a lot of progress within the last 12 months in particular, and the pace of change has been quite significant within our own business for a number of reasons. But maybe just to set the scene a little bit, rewinding 18 months or so, so probably going back to the middle of 2021, ESG wasn't really a term that we were using in our business at that time. We certainly weren't talking about responsible business. It's not to say that we weren't doing things in support of responsible business or sustainability, but we probably weren't talking about it as much as we should be. And at that point in time, the team that has now become ESG as of March this year was known as business compliance. So it was very limited resource dedicated to sustainability. And as the name suggests, that team of individuals, and there were only 2 individuals at the time, I should point out, were really focused on ensuring that our business was remaining within the realms of the law and ensuring that we were complying with any regulatory legislation within the various markets in which we operated. So there was very little time available for those individuals to spend addressing sustainability, proactively, I think it's fair to say. And that's something that has changed significantly, and I think it's been really critical to how much progress we've made over the past 12 months in particular, is the fact that we have invested a lot of additional resource within the team itself, and I can talk a little bit about that. a little bit later on in the presentation. If we think about data collection, which, as we all know, is really critical within sustainability, as part of our organization, as many organizations, particularly within the IT industry, our business is very much shifting towards digital distribution, data-driven insights, and we clearly recognize that sustainability is no different. We need to ensure that we have a very clear picture of the situation, and we're looking at all of the right data points in order to be able to make the right decisions for the right reasons. And if we go back 18 months or so and we think about carbon footprinting in particular, we were collecting emissions data on a limited basis. Our parent company, Datatec, has been reporting to CDP, which was formerly known as Carbon Disclosure Project, as some of you may be aware, had been reporting for 6 or 7 years. And as one of the operating divisions, Westcon was providing input. And we were going through a data collection process on an annual basis. But the reality was it was very limited. We had a lot of gaps, and there were a lot of exclusions from a geographical standpoint. So we very much didn't have a full picture around our impacts across the entire business. So that was a big gap for us. And we did have some foundations in place for an environmental management system. So we've had an environmental policy in place for many, many years. But I think it's probably fair to say that we weren't making the best use of that policy, and it certainly wasn't front and center of what we were doing. So again, one of our priorities within the Responsible Business Programme in general is to make sure that we are communicating our policies, our actions, and what we're doing around reporting very clearly within our own business, but also externally. And that's one of the reasons why we're obviously hosting this webinar today, because we feel it's important to be very transparent around what we were doing in this particular area of the business. Some of you may be aware of EcoVadis, who are a sustainability rating platform. Again, Westcon have had a subscription to the EcoVadis sustainability ratings platform probably for about 10 years now. And that was initially driven by one of our very large customers who are headquartered in France. They were using EcoVadis way back 10 years or so ago, before EcoVadis emerged as a market leader in this area. So we have had a subscription, and we've been going through an annual assessment process for many, many years. But there probably wasn't that much work going on to really proactively tackle some of the improvement areas that came out of those assessments. And again, that's something that has most definitely changed in the last 12 months or so. If we talk about objectives, goals, and targets around sustainability, again, we had very little targets in place 18 months or so ago, and certainly nothing in place around climate change or emissions. And clearly for our business, as it is for many businesses, that's a really large gap, and it's something that we felt strongly that we needed to address very, very quickly. And the last thing really to call out is that we did not have any sustainability report, certainly a standalone report in our own right. That's something that we're working on at the moment. That's something that will be published next month, our inaugural report. Again, given that so much focus and emphasis around sustainability is based on communicating what you are doing in a transparent fashion, the absence of a report was quite a big gap that we have been working to address over the last 9 months or so ago, and really excited to see that report published next month, which we will be more than happy to share with you. So what's changed? Well, I think this is an interesting slide to share with you, because what has happened in my mind, particularly in the last 12 months, is that responsible business is now front and center of our company strategy. So the slide that I'm sharing with you that now is really a snapshot of our company strategy and our critical goals and objectives over the next 5 years. So we've just entered the first year of our next 5-year planning cycle. So these goals and objectives relate to financial year 2023 right through to financial year 2027. And I thought really positive certainly for me in my role and for my team to see. But something that I wanted to share with you is that you can see that responsible business is very much going to be at the strategic foundation of our company strategy over the next 5 years. And you can also see a goal there that we are aiming to achieve 100% of any and all targets that we set around responsible business. So I think the reason why this is so important is that you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, we have, let's call them some more traditional objectives that you would expect from a business. So we have a revenue increase target, we have a target around increasing profitability, but then we also have the responsible business target there as well. And I think this is really reflective around the fact that a change in perception in the way that we are approaching sustainability within our business, and very much a change in the way that we are measuring the success of our business. And I hope you'd agree that obviously having a responsible business target there within the company strategy, it's really reflective of the fact that we're taking a more holistic view of how we're measuring success within our own business. The fact that we obviously have an objective to achieve 100% of what we set out to do from a goals and objectives point of view, probably also very much reflective of the fact that we are taking this very seriously, and we understand that it's absolutely critical that we deliver on what we are planning on setting out on delivering, which in reality are some really ambitious goals and objectives over the next 5 years and beyond. I wanted just to spend a bit of time talking about what we actually mean by responsible business. So I think we really now understand that every business has a role to play in combating some really significant challenges within society, whether they be linked to climate change and the skills gap that we have, championing the pursuit of better mental health and well-being. It's clear to us now that businesses are really critical in driving meaningful solutions to some problems that, clearly don't have easy solutions. And, business really has a responsibility to help come up with innovative solutions to address some of these really inherently challenging problems that we're dealing with in our society today. So when we talk about being a responsible business, we're really talking about giving more consideration to the environment and society at large and the economy at every step. It means not only being driven by profit, as I've just talked about, but also by a desire to improve the world through ethically sound processes, services and solutions, equal working conditions and opportunities, and also focusing on minimizing impact on the planet. So as well as being the right thing to do, responsible business is a business imperative. Our partners need us to be a responsible business to keep with their own goals and standards and to meet their own customer expectations. So this is a really clear link between what we're doing around sustainability and partner success, which you can see there. It's really central to everything that we are planning on doing as a business over the next 5-year period. So by being aligned to these principles and keeping it at the forefront of how we engage and support our partners, we're going to leave ourselves in an even better position to continue to drive customer success, which, as I mentioned, is really critical to what we are doing throughout our business. So that is why being a responsible business is at the top of our agenda. And our purpose is very much to provide a sustainable future, not only for our own business, but also the world around us. Just diving into a bit more detail, our responsible business is split into 3 key pillars: people, planet, and communities. So when we talk about people, we're really recognizing that our people are the heart of our business. We wouldn't have a business without those people. So creating an inclusive culture that's happy and healthy, and ensuring that our people have fulfilling careers and opportunities that they need to reach their aspirations is clearly very critical for us. In doing so, we nurture professional growth in our employees every day, giving them the freedom and tools they need to blaze their own trails. If we're thinking about planet, tackling climate change and protecting our planet is also very critical to our business. Our supply chain emissions are our largest impact. So to address this, we intend to use our scale and influence within the supply chain to promote sustainability and help our partners do the same. We're also very much intending on minimizing our environmental footprint as far as possible by further enabling circular and environmentally responsible technology, providing commercial value to our partners and our vendors. And finally, from a community point of view, We're intending on taking a two-pronged approach to our community initiatives, social and business. So socially, we create employment opportunities to help young people develop their skills and empower those less fortunate to map a new pathway in life. And business-wise, we mobilize our partner ecosystem to drive collaboration and mutual success through enjoyable activities and events. So I'm now going to dive a little bit deeper into the planet pillar within our responsible business framework. And our planet pillar is split into three main areas, which I'm going to address in turn. The first being climate change, which I don't think really needs any introduction. I think everyone's now aware of the fact that climate change is here and it's already affecting everyone's lives, whether they like it or not. Promoting a sustainable supply chain is the second pillar. Again, that's very critical for us, particularly given that the vast majority of our emissions sit within the supply chain. And last but not least, promoting environmentally responsible technology solutions in support of circular economy principles. So starting with climate change, I think the timing is quite interesting because obviously we're a week away from COP27, which is taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh. And just looking at various articles in the media over the past couple of weeks, I think it's probably fair to say that there's a significant amount of trepidation in advance of COP27 kicking off. I think the last 12 months have clearly been a very challenging time, both politically, economically. There's been a lot of issues. We've got the war in Ukraine and Russia, which has disrupted energy supplies. And there was a report that the UN published only last week or so. And the gist of that report was talking about the fact that the 1.5 degree temperature target, which 188 countries committed to achieving back in Paris in 2015, is now more fragile than ever. I think the other thing that's probably at the top of a lot of people's minds is, have the more developed nations actually taken the actions that they committed to take this time last year at COP26 in Glasgow? And I think the answer that we're probably going to come to, when we actually, go into that event next week, is that they probably haven't done so. And I think one of the fears is that that's very much going to weaken the commitment that more developing nations are making, because if the more developed nations, who arguably have a lot more capacity, investment and capability to deliver upon their commitments, aren't doing so, then you could say that that leaves the developing nations scratching their heads and wondering, why they should be trying to overcome significant barriers in order to make their own contributions. I think there's probably one positive thing that I've seen in the media over the past couple of weeks, which is around the fact that emissions associated with energy generation are actually expected to peak in 2025. And this is something that very much has been accelerated by the Ukraine-Russia conflict, really just down to the fact that countries have had to move to invest in renewable and green energy projects and move away from fossil fuels. So that's probably a glimmer of hope, obviously an unintended consequence of that war in Ukraine. But at the same time, I think it shows that, when push comes to shove and we have, a clear risk to, or a barrier, that by working together, countries can make quite significant change in a relatively short space of time. So I digress, but yeah, like I say, interesting to see what the outcome of COP27 is later this month. So when we're talking about climate change for Westcon Comstore and responsible business, this is really where we started at the beginning of this year, when we were putting together the foundations of what now is our responsible business program. And rather than just diving into what we had a very long list of things that we knew we needed to do. But rather than just dive in and start tackling things, we felt that we needed to take a step back and formally define a strategy in terms of what we were going to do. And one of the reasons for that, I think we recognized even at the outset, before we'd really dug into the detail, that what we're doing within the business or what we need to do around climate change was going to have a transformational impact around the way that we are doing business and the way that we are collaborating and interacting with both our partners and our vendors. So we spent 2 or 3 months working alongside an external consultancy, working on a climate strategy definition project. So what that really looked like in practice is a consultancy came in, they looked at what we were doing within our business already today, and they also spent a lot of time doing some peer benchmarking. So they looked at some of the other large global distributors within the industry, and they also looked at some of our vendors and partners. And the intention really was to allow us to get a much better understanding of where our peers were in terms of their own climate change programs, how well developed they were. And the idea was that that would help guide our ambition level in terms of, how ambitious do we need to do? And it emerged very quickly that at a minimum, we wanted to ensure that we were competing with our contemporaries and with our peers. And we also have an aspiration that, in the medium term and the longer term, we want to be a leader around climate change because we think that there's a significant opportunity that comes with that, from a commercial standpoint. So the outcome of this project was a 5-year roadmap of activities to move us towards decarbonisation. It was a really successful project. It was supported by all 10 members of Westcon's executive leadership team. And I think that's probably an important point to call out, because I think it's fair to say that there's no way that you can build a successful program around climate change or sustainability, for that matter, without having the support and commitment from the leaders within any business, and it really does go back to the fact that it's going to take transformational change within our own business. There's going to be a level of investment that's needed. And in a way, it's also going to be quite disruptive in a lot of respects, because we've really got to take a step back and start looking at the way we are doing business, across all of the functions, and start asking ourselves certain questions around, what could we be doing differently in order to align to our goals and objectives from a climate change point of view. So we completed that project in May of this year. And like I said, it gave us a really clear picture of exactly what we needed to do and helped us put some priority around certain activities. One of the first things on the list on that roadmap was for us to establish a complete carbon footprint across our business, across scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions categories. So as I mentioned before, we were already working to provide limited information relating to our carbon footprint to our parent company Datatec on an annual basis as part of their CDP submission, but we realized that that wasn't going to be sufficient for us moving forward. So we undertook a very detailed carbon footprinting program. That project ran for roughly 8 weeks, and we went out and we really dug very deep to build a very detailed picture of what those emissions looked like across our entire organization. So we made sure that we were including all of our operations, including some of those which had been excluded previously because perhaps we deemed that they were not material or relevant due to their relative size or the revenue that they were generating for the business. If any of you have ever worked or been involved in undertaking a carbon footprinting exercise, I'm sure you're aware of the fact that it's inherently challenging because you're having to go out and collect data relating to all aspects of the way that your business is operating. So if we're talking about scope 1, it's obviously fuel that we are burning either in our boilers to heat our buildings or in vehicles that we're using. And from a scope 2 perspective, it's really relating to energy that we're purchasing. So going out and collecting data relating to energy usage, which can be quite challenging, particularly when you have office space within multi-occupancy buildings. So that was a big challenge for us, working to try and obtain that information from the landlords, things that they're not always within your control. And we also spent a significant amount of time conducting a Scope 3 screening assessment. So when we went into that assessment, we were already working under the impression, or making the assumption, that the vast majority of our emissions would sit within the supply chain. And that was really relating to the fact that, we're not a manufacturer, we're a services company. And as such, traditionally our emissions were not expected to be significant in comparison to one of our manufacturers or vendors, for example, Cisco. What we weren't anticipating is that when we'd completed that exercise, we estimated that 99% of our total emissions sat within the supply chain. So we thought that it was going to be significant, but perhaps not that significant. And that really, leads me on to the point, the fact that supply chain engagement is obviously going to be really critical to everything we're doing around climate change, because clearly we have a responsibility to reduce emissions within our own business in support of our climate change objectives. So we need to move to renewable energy sources that we're purchasing. We need to improve the energy efficiency of our buildings, and we need to transition away from internal combustion vehicles in terms of our company fleet. But the reality is a lot of the most challenging work inherently is going to sit within the supply chain, and that's going to be it's going to be really critical for us to build a very robust supply chain engagement program in order to deliver against our objectives and commitments around climate change. So taking a step back, when I'm talking about objectives and commitments, in July this year, our CEO, David Grant, signed a commitment letter, which we then submitted to the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTi. And that commitment letter was effectively laying out a statement that we were intending on setting some net zero decarbonisation targets within our business, and for having those targets validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. So I think, for me personally, a really big milestone, in that we'd spent a lot of time talking about strategy, and we were all in agreement that this was the road that we needed to go down. But that was really the first time that we were putting our money where our mouth is, and we were putting that commitment into the public domain. So as some of you may be aware, once you submit that letter to SBTi and it's accepted, you have 24 months to actually develop your targets and arrange for them to be validated and independently verified by the Science Based Targets Initiative. But at that point in time, when your letter is submitted and accepted, you are actually then listed on their website as committed to set those targets. So what it really comes down to, in my mind, is once you've made that commitment, there is no going back. So again, just I think a really big step from a perception point of view, to make it very clear to all of our stakeholders that this is the direction that we're moving in. Yes. So in terms of the second half, we're moving into the last third of this financial year. And I just wanted to talk about some of the things that we're currently working on. So right now we are working on setting both near-term and long-term decarbonisation targets in line with SBTi methodology. So that's very much a requirement. In order to be in line with SBTi's net zero standard, you need to set both near and long-term targets. We're in the process of modelling those targets at the moment. So really taking that baseline that we established earlier in the year and modelling what effectively will be a 90% reduction in emissions by the year 2050. So there are some considerations to make, because although there are some minimum requirements associated with target setting, which are really linked to that 90% reduction by 2050, there are some different ways that you can approach target setting, particularly in Scope 3. So there's some various options. You can go down the path of engagement targets, which is really around making a commitment that you will work to ensure that X percentage of your suppliers will be setting their own targets or committing to set SBTi targets by the year 2025. But there's also the opportunity to set absolute contraction targets, which is whereby you're ultimately committing that by X date, and that date would normally be 2030, that your supply chain will have reduced their emissions by X percentage. So I can't share any details around the specifics right now, but we are very close to being in a position whereby we have those targets finalized. And obviously, once we have finalized those, we'll be communicating those externally to make sure that everyone's clear exactly what we have committed to do. So yes, those targets are in process at the moment, and we expect to complete them in the next 4 to 6 weeks, alongside an emission reduction action plan. So in reality, it's all well and good having targets, but clearly we need to have a very clear picture around how we intend to deliver on those targets. So that's really coming down to practical changes within our business, and some of the things I mentioned earlier, shifting to electric vehicles, shifting to renewable energy sources, all those type of things. And that will be a year by year plan. So it will allow us to identify where we can make significant reductions in emissions very quickly. So you could look at those as quick wins. So that's will be starting work. And like I say, that plan will be finalized alongside the targets in the next 4 to 6 weeks. One of the other things I just wanted to mention very briefly before we move on is the fact that we are working on implementing a reporting platform which will help us track key metrics across ESG criteria moving forward. So we're working with a partner called GCX, who have developed a platform which allows companies to track metrics across a whole host of data points. So carbon emissions, energy usage, water, waste, it very much can be customized to meet the needs of our business. That's one of the reasons why we selected GCX as a partner we wanted to work with. And the reason why I think this is important is that we recognize that we need to move away from tracking this data in a manual fashion. You know, in reality, last year we were working in spreadsheets. It's not very practical, it's not efficient, it's not scalable. So we're going to pull all of this data into an intelligent platform, and it's going to allow us to not only get a better view around how we're progressing against those targets, we can also plug specific emission reduction scenarios into the tool, and it will help us visualize exactly what impact those particular initiatives will have on our targets. So that's something that the implementation has already started, and we're hoping to have up and running by the new year. So that's due to complete in January time. Again, just going to be really, really critical that we're going to be tracking this data very, very closely. We're going to be moving away from looking at these metrics on an annual basis, and it's something that we're going to be looking at collecting data on a monthly basis, again, just to increase really the visibility around how we're progressing against targets that we're putting in place. So I mentioned the Science Based Targets Initiative already. I'm sure that many of you will already be familiar with this organization. So the SBTI is a partnership between CDP, which is formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, the United Nations Global Compact, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF. So it's a not-for-profit organization, and SBTI really defines and promotes best practice when planning emission reductions and setting targets within a business. And the reason why they are a market leader is that their methodology is very much, the foundation for their methodology is very much in line with the latest climate science. So when we talk about a net zero commitment that we have made as an organization alongside SBTI, we're really talking about the fact that those targets that we will be setting should be in line with a 1.5 degree trajectory. And what I mean by that specifically is that climate scientists, I say all agree, there's generally a consensus that we need to limit, or the planet needs to limit, any global temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in order to avoid the most significant or catastrophic impacts of climate change. So very much tied to what the science is saying, and that's obviously very important, and just means that any targets that are validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative, they obviously carry quite a lot of credibility. You can see some logos on the right hand side there. So that's just an example of some of the partners and vendors that we work with, and some of our largest partners are there. You know, you see the likes of BT and Atos, Cisco there as well. These are all organizations who have aligned with SBTi already to some extent. So some of these organizations have already had their targets validated and sanity checked by SBTi, but all of them have committed to set targets. So thinking about Cisco, probably about three or four months ago, Cisco was actually one of the first organizations within the IT industry to have their net zero targets actually validated and approved by SBTi. So not surprising to see that Cisco are leading the way there, given the fact that they obviously have a very well-established sustainability program within their business already. So yes, I mean, I think it's, aside from the fact that SBTi methodology is recognized as a market leader, it's also very important for us to align to their methodology, because a lot of our partners and vendors are taking steps to ensure that they will only be working with suppliers who are aligned to SBTi's program in the not too distant future. So it's a very clear driver for us. It's in reality, it's the right direction to go in regardless, but we are getting a lot of pressure from our partners as well to make sure that we are aligning to SBTi in particular, as opposed to any other frameworks around target setting and decarbonisation. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of slides around the baseline that I've talked about already. So this baseline relates to our financial year 2022. So our financial year runs from March through to February. So this baseline that we've established relates to the activities and operations going on within our business between March of 2021 and February of 2022 of this year. And I just wanted to share with you the breakdown of what those emissions really look like. So if we look at scope 1 on the left hand side, you can see that roughly 75% of our scope 1 emissions relate to mobile combustion. So this is really the fuel that we're burning in company vehicles. And we've already launched one initiative which is being piloted at the moment within the UK. It's the Octopus Energy Electric Vehicle Scheme. It's a salary sacrifice scheme, so it's, at the end of the day, it's an additional benefit that we are offering our UK employees, and it allows them to get hold of a brand new electric vehicle. And it's the salary sacrifice, the nature of the scheme being salary sacrifice means that they can make a significant cost saving on leasing an electric vehicle, and in comparison to taking a lease privately or purchasing that vehicle elsewhere. So it's very much in support of helping our employees move away from internal combustion vehicles and making a transition to electrical vehicles possible for more employees, where perhaps without this scheme in place it would be something that would just be prohibitively expensive for a lot of people at this point in time. So that scheme is being piloted in the UK at the moment, and assuming that it's successful, we're hoping to roll it out through Europe in the not too distant future, and that scheme is just something that's going to be really critical to reduce the emissions that are linked to mobile combustion and ultimately the fuel that we're burning in those vehicles at this point in time. On the right hand side, you've just got the market-based and location-based calculation for our scope 2 calculations. The vast majority, if not all of these emissions, are linked to purchased energy. We are already procuring some renewable energy within our business, but this is going to be one of our top priorities over the next 6 months or so, and probably some of the very big ticket items on our emission reduction actions plan is going to be identifying opportunities to move more of our energy procurement across to green or renewable sources, and that will be one of the primary mechanisms that we will be using in order to reduce those scope 2 emissions moving forward. So you can see that the total emissions in scope 1 and scope 2 for our business are just shy of 4,000 tonnes of CO2 last year. So in comparison to our scope 3 emissions, that 4,000 tonnes or so of CO2 obviously looks a little bit insignificant, because you can see there that off the back of the scope 3 screening assessment that we completed, we're estimating that as much as we have roughly 750,000 tons of emissions sitting within our supply chain, and the vast majority of those emissions sit within two categories: purchased goods and services and use of sold products. So when we're talking about purchased goods and services, this is really relating to the products and services that we are purchasing from our vendors and the manufacturers for whom we're distributing on behalf of, for then sale onto our partners and ultimately onto end users. So this encompasses all of the emissions associated with the manufacture of those goods, and clearly it's a significant value there, and something that is going to be challenging for us to address. And really the only way that we are going to be able to address these emissions is through engagement and collaboration with our vendors. So the reality is some of our vendors, and I'll take Cisco as another example, are already working very aggressively to eliminate emissions from their business. So if Cisco, I believe, have a net zero target, which they're aiming to achieve by the year 2045. And the other way of looking at scope 3 emissions is that our scope 3 emissions are someone else's scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the reason why I think that's important is that as long as you are working with vendors who are sharing your ambitions and who have made similar commitments, I think we can be confident that over time, those emissions will inevitably reduce as those vendors work to find, innovative ways of reducing the emissions linked to manufacturing those products. And that's something that we want to be working very closely with our vendors on, in terms of understanding how we can help them. We're a very critical part of those vendor supply chains, and we very much want to be assisting them as far as possible to reduce their emissions, because in turn that obviously helps us achieve or move towards achieving our own targets around scope 3 emission reduction. The other category that's very significant there that you can see is around use of sold products. So this one's probably more challenging, because ultimately use of sold products, we're really talking about the energy that these products consume when they get to the end user. So obviously, working in the world of distribution, we have direct relationships with both our vendors upstream, and we have a direct relationship with our partners downstream, but we don't necessarily have, or generally have, any interaction with the end users who are actually using the products for the most part. So inherently there's a challenge there for us, because we don't have that relationship, and that probably limits our ability to engage and ultimately influence how those products are used. And at a very simplistic level, well, there's a couple of things that you can consider, or we could consider, from when we're thinking about use of sold products. One thing is that ultimately, if everyone was using renewable energy to power those products, then the emissions would be significantly less than they are versus using non-renewable energy sources to power them. And the second piece is really around the energy efficiency of those products themselves. So a lot of our vendors are investing a significant amount of R&D around improving the energy efficiency of their power supplies, because again, they recognize that this is a significant impact that their products are creating through product use. So supply chain sustainability, as I mentioned, is going to be absolutely critical for us for a number of reasons, but particularly because we have such a significant proportion of our emissions sitting within the supply chain. So right now, we are building out a risk analysis framework within our business, with an objective to complete an evaluation on our top 10 vendors in the second half of this year. So initially, we were looking at a number of tools that could help us conduct some risk analysis, but we took a step back and we realized that one of the opportunities that I think we have as a specialist distributor is that we actually have a relatively small number of vendors that account for quite a significant proportion of our supplier spend as a business. So for example, we may have 8 vendors that we work with that account for 90% of our revenue spend. And therefore the logic is that if we can engage with those vendors successfully and make sure that they are on the same track as us from a climate change perspective, then that really will help us meet our targets. And practically speaking, we probably have an advantage there in comparison to some of the broadliners. So if you think about your Ingram Micros and your Tech Datas, who have thousands of vendors for whom they act as a distributor for, they have a really mammoth task. You know, in terms of just starting out, which of those vendors should they be looking at? Which of those vendors represent, you know, inherent risks from a sustainability point of view? So I think we do have an advantage there, being a specialist distributor and obviously having very deep relationships with the vendors that we do work with, because that's only going to help us, you know, not only identify which of those vendors we feel are at risk for any reason, but also just makes the task of practically engaging with those vendors a little bit more manageable, you know, within what's still in reality a relatively small team within our business. So we're building that framework at the moment. And the idea is that once we've completed that initial analysis, we're going to have a much clearer picture around where our risks sit and where we should therefore be directing our focus from an engagement point of view. That said, we have already commenced some engagement with the sustainability leads within our key vendors. So we want to make sure that we are beginning to build the foundations of those relationships, which are going to be very important for us moving forward. And the idea really is just to make some introductions, to start building out a network of contacts, and also to start identifying areas of common interest and future collaboration. And I think one of the really positive things that we've taken from some of those initial conversations is that the individuals that we've spoken to, they're very open to having transparent and frank conversations about the risks and the opportunities that sustainability represents for their own businesses and for the channel in general. So it's very nice to have some quite refreshingly frank conversations, and again, really tied into the fact that transparency is seen as fundamental to the success of any sustainability program within a business or a supply chain. And last but not least, we are in the process of implementing the ISO 14001 environmental management system within our European logistics centres. So we are undertaking our assessments for our European logistics centres this month. So we're expecting to be certified by next month, December. And in the APAC part of our business, we're already starting a gap analysis to better understand the work that we need to do to also obtain certifications in our key locations in the region, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. And the reason we picked those locations is that, again, that's where our primary logistics distribution centres are situated, and it's also where we're generating a lot of significant impacts as a business. Have a quick time check. So just to talk very quickly about circular technology, this is something that Westcon Comstore has actually been supporting for 15 years now. So we've had some really successful programs with some of our largest global customers, so telcos and service providers, whereby we have been helping them recover equipment from end user sites when equipment has reached the end of its useful life at a particular site. We've been bringing that equipment back to our facilities, and we've been cleaning it up, we've been refurbishing it, and we've been putting it back on the shelves to make it available to be reused for other customers of that particular partner. So we always recognized that this was something that was clearly in support of sustainability goals, but I don't think we necessarily did it justice in terms of the scale of what we were doing and how that was supporting circular economy principles. So I mean, I think e-waste is one of the fastest growing waste streams globally. I think last year over 50 million tons of e-waste was generated globally, and as such, this is clearly an area whereby we and the industry is generating such a significant impact. So the more we can do to provide solutions for our partners to help them manage circular technology in a better way is clearly going to be very critical in supporting partner success and making sure that our partners can meet their own goals and objectives around circular technology and principle. And we will be looking to expand our capabilities in this area in future to make sure that we can support more partners, because I think more and more partners will be asking questions of their distributors in terms of how we can help them with this and how we can leverage our logistics capabilities and some of our value add capabilities. So yes, we need to be very creative, and we need to look at ways in which we can make those type of services available to everyone who needs them. So I've reached the end of my presentation. I appreciate I've probably a little bit over time, but I'd really appreciate the opportunity to answer any questions that anyone might have. And Duncan, not sure if there's anything that's been dropped into the Q&A box already that we can pick up and answer.
There absolutely has been something dropped into the Q&A box. So one of the questions that has come in is actually a really good and quite broad question. What would you like to see more of from your vendor partners to help you achieve and accelerate your carbon reduction goals?
Well, I think first and foremost, what we really need to see from the vendors will be more of our vendors making commitments to decarbonize their business, because although some of our vendors, and again, I'll use Cisco as an example, Cisco obviously represents a really significant proportion of our business in terms of the products and services that we sell. The fact that Cisco have already got a validated target alongside the SBTi, that's really critical for us and really helps us in terms of this journey. So if there was one thing that was absolutely critical that our vendors can do to help us on this journey, it's by making a commitment to set decarbonisation targets within their own business, because the reality is we're going to get to a point whereby if our vendors are not moving in that direction, I think we're going to have to question, the nature of our ongoing relationship with those vendors, because we can't achieve our responsible business objectives, particularly around climate change, unless our vendors also make similar commitments. So that would probably be top of my list in terms of things that we'd like to see from vendors. We'd like to see more of our vendors taking that first step and making a commitment to set these targets in line with climate science.
Thank you so much. Another, well, really appropriate spot-on question. Quite an understated question, actually. When calculating Scope 3 emissions, was it difficult to get truly accurate figures rather than rough estimates?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And in fact, I should call out that Scope 3 emissions, for most businesses at the moment, there isn't primary data sources available in a lot of cases. So if we're thinking about our Scope 3 screening assessment, the intention is that you come out with a figure that you can use in order to set a baseline from which to track progress. It's very much our expectation that as the data confidence improves as we move forward, as more and more of our vendors start hopefully setting targets and tracking carbon emissions, naturally over time the data confidence in Scope 3 will improve and will increase, and as such we will refine our Scope 3 emission baseline. So in fact, one of the things that we will need to do once we have validated a target alongside SBTi, every 5 years at a minimum, you need to go back and revisit your baseline and reassess and make sure that it is still accurate. And as I mentioned, data quality is improving, it's taking time, but in 5 years' time, when we go back and revisit that baseline, we absolutely expect it to change. And that's the reason why companies have to do that, because you need to make sure that the baseline that you are tracking progress over a relatively long period, because ultimately we're setting a long-term target which will be tagged to 2050, so that's 28 years away. You always need to be going back and reassessing your baseline. And in terms of those figures that I shared for our business, a lot of that baseline was calculated based on financial spend as opposed to primary data sources. So just to give you an example, if you're talking about purchase goods and services, which as I mentioned is really related to the products and services we're buying from the vendors, right now most vendors are not able to give us, or anyone for that matter, an emissions value by product. If they could, it would be very easy for us to calculate a fairly precise emissions value based on all of the products and services that we purchase from them in any given year. But right now, they don't have that information. And as such, you go down the hierarchy, and this is all set out within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It effectively outlines acceptable methodology for calculating emissions across the 15 categories in Scope 3. So we're not working from a lot of primary data sources at this point in time, I think, is the short answer. And moving forward, a large focus for our business, particularly over the next couple of years, will be improving data confidence across all of those categories. So it's going back to the first question, thinking about what else can the vendors do to help us. That's probably second on the list after making their own commitments around decarbonisation. It's really going to be making better information available to us, which, around the carbon emissions linked to their products and services.
Mark, this has been a fantastic conversation. These were two really useful questions, really appropriate questions, reflecting the real complexity that your vendor partners have in understanding their goals and their opportunities. As I mentioned earlier on, we'll have a recording of this that we will share with the attendees and with people who registered but were not able to attend it, like the people in the Americas, for example. But really, Mark, thank you so much. I actually haven't seen a distributor talking in this level of clarity about what they're doing, and I think it gives a really useful benchmark, not just to show Westcon Comstor's journey, but also to show what others in the channel can be doing to better understand and thus manage what they are doing. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks to all the attendees. Really appreciate your time today. And thanks, Duncan, for hosting.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.